Hi there, sixth graders. This is World History, Chapter 14 about medieval Europe. Today we have Lesson 3, Life in the Middle Ages. Page 400, do follow along. The church, feudalism, and manor life formed the foundation of European medieval life. We have quite a list here of vocabulary. You've no doubt heard of some of these words before. Europe, Christine D. Passan, monk, nun, monastery, convent, missionary, monarch, serf, knight, chivalry, guild, and milady. And three terms: feudalism, manor system, and three-field rotation. First, you are there. It's September, and the cold night has lasted until morning. You pull the quilt up to your chin to stay warm. Wait! Today is Michaelmas, a holiday. Everyone will be at the fair. You rush to dress, eat, and leave for the commons. As you near the fair, you see stalls offering pottery, saddles, jewelry, fabric, glassware, bread, and even armor for sale. The merchants have come from miles away. You make your way through the musicians, acrobats, and candy sellers. You can smell the Michaelmas goose cooking, and you want to make sure to get a taste of it for good luck. Beyond the food, you stop to watch a few wrestling matches, followed by archery contests. On your left are more food stalls. These are full of all things ginger, cake, beverages, cookies, and caramels. You meet a friend, and together you play several games of Nine Men's Morris before you head home. This always reminds me of riverboat days. If you've ever been to Yankton's riverboat days in August, it has to be much like this special holiday was back in medieval times. Page 401, the church. The Michaelmas holiday you just read about was one of the many Christian feast days celebrated in medieval Europe. During the Middle Ages, Christianity was an important part of daily life. Not all Europeans were Christians. Some were Jews and others were Muslims, but most were Christians. Like Muslims, Christians showed their devotion by going on a pilgrimage to Rome or Jerusalem, not to Mecca. To Jews, Christians, and Muslims, Jerusalem was a holy city. However, Rome was the holy center of Christendom, or kingdom of the Christians. The Christian leader, or pope, lived in Rome. He was just as powerful as a king was. Building cathedrals with magnificent stained glass windows became a major focus of medieval life. Entire towns worked to build these large churches that took decades or even hundreds of years to finish. For example, the construction of the Chartres Cathedral in northwestern France began around 1145. After a fire, Chartres was constructed and completed by 1260, over 100 years. The Christian faith centered around the Christian church. Some young people even devoted their lives to religion. Some men who did this were called monks, and women were called nuns. Monks studied, prayed, and lived in communities called monasteries. Nuns lived in similar communities called convents. Both monasteries and convents served as centers of religion and education. In addition to praying and studying, monks and nuns cultivated crops and helped the poor. Some monks became missionaries, or people who teach a religion to people with different beliefs. Feudalism. During the Middle Ages, Europe had few strong central governments. People formed their own systems to meet their need for protection and justice. Feudalism was a political, social, and economic system that began in the 800s. It provided the needed protection for people. Feudalism resembled a social structure. At the top was a monarch, a king or a queen who was the supreme ruler. The next level included lords, who pledged their loyalty to the monarch and military support in the event of a war or conflict. In return, the monarch granted the lord an estate. The lord owned the land. He also received a large percentage of the crops produced on the land and received all of the income from the crops. He collected taxes, maintained order, enforced laws, and protected the serfs. The serfs were the people who lived on the land and farmed it. A saying of the time was, "No land without a lord, and no lord without land." Many lords had knights, or warriors, trained and prepared to fight on horseback. Knights had a code of behavior called chivalry. According to the code, a true knight had deep faith, was ready to die for his church, gave generously to all, and used his strength to stand against injustice. Between 1100 and 1300, most knights received some land from their lords. Feudalism declines. Serfs, who are sometimes called peasants, formed the base of society in the Middle Ages. Unlike kings, lords, and knights, who were bound to be faithful to one another, serfs had no such loyalty to anyone. Serfs were not slaves, but yet they could not become knights. They could not be bought or sold, separate from the land. Even so, serfs were tied to the land they worked and could not leave it without the lord's permission. As time passed, some lords had many faithful knights, therefore building up much military power. These lords became independent of the monarch, who had originally granted the land to them. The lords substituted payment in money for actual military support, and by the 1400s, feudalism had begun to decline. The manor system. Because feudalism was based on holding land, it is sometimes confused with the manor system, which was one way of organizing agricultural labor. The manor system, common from the 700s to the 1200s, was a way to manage feudal lands. Manors usually had 4 parts: the manor house and village, farmland, meadowland, and wasteland. The manor house or castle was home to the lord of the estate. Gardens, orchards, and farm buildings often surrounded the manor house. Most manors included a church and a mill for grinding grain to flour. Serfs' cottages were clustered together, forming a small village. The mud brick cottages had reinforced straw walls, dirt floors, and straw thatched roofs. A cottage usually consisted of a single room with little floor space and a low ceiling. Many cottages had small vegetable and fruit gardens. Many serfs shared their cottages with livestock and other animals on the manor. They heated their cottages with woods that they chopped from nearby forests. In addition to working in the fields all day, many serfs worshipped in church. Serfdom was a difficult life. The church offered them hope and peace. After about 1000, serfs worked the manor lands using the 3-field rotation system. In this system, every serf was assigned a strip of land in each of the manor's 3 fields. In the fall, 1 field was planted with wheat or rye. In the spring, the 2nd field was planted with oats or barley. The 3rd field was unplanted so that the soil could stay fertile. Each year, the fields were rotated. Fields were divided into long strips, about 1 acre in size. Some of the strips contained good soil, some poor. The best soil was set aside for the lord of the manor. In addition to their own strips, peasants had to work the lord's land at least 3 days a week. The manor's working animals grazed on the meadowland. Meadowlands and wastelands often included ponds and streams for fishing. They provided summer pasture for animals, as well as wood for fuel and building materials. They also provided foods such as nuts, berries, honey, rabbits, and wild fowl. The manor system generally met all the needs of the lord, knights, and serfs living there. It even allowed for crop surpluses. Serfs could sell the surpluses from the strips to people living in towns and cities. And with a surplus, towns and cities began to grow. Guilds. By about 1000, once cities had begun to flourish, guilds formed. A guild was a group of people united by a common interest. A merchant guild included all the traders of a town. The guild worked together to buy large quantities of goods cheaply and to control the market. A merchant who was not a member of the town's guild could not sell goods in the town. Guilds also guaranteed a fair price for goods. Workers such as bakers, goldsmiths, tailors, and weavers formed craft guilds. These guilds controlled the quality and quantity of production. Guilds protected the town's merchants and craftspeople from having to compete with those from outside of the town. Medieval women. During the Middle Ages, most women had few rights. Unmarried women who owned some land did have rights. However, when they married, they had to give up their rights. A lady, or a woman of noble birth, was given little opportunity to make decisions about her own life. Usually a lady's actions were directed by her father or her husband. She often had little to do with the estate. Servants managed the lord's affairs, and nurses took care of the children. In contrast, a woman living in the village had more work to do. Wives often worked on the lands with their husbands. Unmarried women worked as servant girls or as hired agricultural workers. Women living in towns worked in nearly all of the trades. Even though they could participate in the craft, they were kept out of decision-making discussions. Some women did break out of the common roles led by medieval women. One of these was Christine de Pizan. She was one of the few medieval women to earn a living by writing. She wrote poetry and books, protesting the way women were both glorified and insulted by male authors. Thanks for listening.